Hello and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation Podcast. My name is Naweed Jabakil. I'm very glad to be your host today. In today's episode, we'll dive into one of the most pressing challenges of our time, sustainability and climate resilience in the GCC. The Gulf is a region defined by its energy heritage, rapid urban growth, and unique environmental challenges, from water scarcity to rising temperatures. But it's also a region driving bold visions for the future, with innovation and leadership changing and shaping how we adapt and thrive to a changing climate. Joining me to discuss more of this is Michael Wood, partner of sustainability at consulting firm EY, who will help us unpack the policies, technologies, and strategies shaping the path forward and explore what a climate resilient GCC might look like by 2050. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today.
Let's start with the opening strategic question then, because if you look at the major players in the Gulf, Qatar's National Vision 2030, Saudi's Vision 2030, and the UAE's Net Zero by 2050 pledges playing a major role in moving forward decarbonisation. Give us your sense of how they're advancing sustainability.
Yeah, sure. I mean, these visions, if I could just simplify it, these serve as the strategic long-term blueprints for these economies. Now, any sort of investment and development decisions absolutely go through and are channeled through these vision statements. So these are absolutely critical for investment beyond sustainability. And fortunately for sustainability, it's absolutely embedded into the DNA of the visions themselves. And it's seen to go hand in hand both with economic and social development. Now, some of the key features of these visions from a sustainability perspective, and much broader, is around economic diversification. And that's simply beyond oil and gas revenues for the states and for the countries. Also unlocking investment, both inbound and outbound investment, as well as global alignment. And the Sustainable Development Goals have been a common theme throughout most of the visions, and they've played a significant role shaping these up. And this also goes into deeper and more specific alignment with global aspirations, such as the Conference of Party commitments through climate, nature and land. But if we do look at the four main areas, if we look at Qatar, for example, Qatar focuses on human, social, environmental and economic development. And there's a theme currently around sustainable production and consumption, for example. That's of in front and center at the moment for the state of Qatar. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it focuses on economic diversification and growth, but there's a real cultural national identity coming through strongly through that national vision. And there's probably no other ambitious statement and campaign like the 10 billion trees over the next couple of decades planted in Saudi Arabia. So we're starting to see these things. The long and the short is that these national visions are absolutely central to any investment and decision making, and they're catalysts for change.
And these national visions obviously guiding the domestic approach in each country, as you say, but climate change is a shared common threat, not just for GCC states, but the wider Middle East and the wider world. Any signs of regional cooperation and working together to try and overcome some of these challenges?
Yeah, look, it's a shared issue. And I think, if we're looking at a policy perspective, for example, let's look at that. One of the challenges around particularly for the region is how effective policies can be, and ultimately the effectiveness of policies can really only be determined post-mortem, once things have happened, and to understand how effective they are versus the objectives and whether it's actually produced a positive impact. Unfortunately, this is not a symptom specific to the GCC, but in general, most climate policies fail. And recent study by Oxford analysed over 1,500 climate policies across 41 countries using machine learning, and it identified through that process only roughly 4% of that population achieved anything meaningful. So the key thing for collaboration and coordination with the GCC is making sure that these policy interventions are just not a binary singular approach. For example, if IFRS reporting, which is a real focus at the moment, needs to be coupled with other things to be fully effective. And once again, this is not a symptom that's specific to the GCC. This is a global phenomena. But when we are looking at it, things that are really effective within the GCC, we've got common issues, which is obviously our dependence on revenue generation from oil and gas. There is a focus and a need to be coordinated around how we approach these shared problems. Absolutely, from an emissions perspective. There's also nature-based solutions that will have co-benefits for everybody. And we are seeing, adaptation, for example, from a cooperation perspective. Inherently, the GCC is already highly adaptive and resilient. That needs to be improved continuously as things start to intensify. But where we do see the need for greater collaboration is certainly in the mitigation space.
And just to pick up on that final point about adaptation, what one thing that many Gulf countries have in common is booming cities. If you take Dubai or Riyadh, for example, population growth significant there and expected to continue rising. So urban development, infrastructure development, they become key areas when it comes to decarbonising. How do you think Gulf cities, many of them which are like Dubai in coastal heat-stressed areas, how can they adapt their urban planning looking forward to deal better with climate risks?
Yeah, I think, it's a key pressing issue. There's a number of perils that will ultimately impact at some point in time these infrastructure and these urban developments. But if I can use an example, I think for me personally, this resonates, and this resonates with other folk that I talk to. It's around humidity, and let's just deep dive into humidity for a second. So for every degree Celsius rise, the air's ability to hold water increases by 7%. So what we're talking about is the absolute humidity here. And this is the ability, once again, of the atmosphere to hold water. So why that's important? That's important for a number of different reasons, from human health perspective, from an infrastructure side. So if we look at the MENA region specifically, under almost all scenarios, temperature is going to increase. And therefore, we can expect humidity to increase, particularly for those locations where we have a water source, such as the Arabian Gulf or the Red Sea. That provides a excellent water source for increasing humidity. Now, so how might this impact urban development and infrastructure? So if you're looking at high humidity impacts on materials performance, for example, you've got corrosion, carbonation, you've got issues around the integrity of those types of products. In terms of efficiency as well, do we need pre-treatment? What sort of HVAC infrastructure do we need, or pre-treatment do we need? How will humidity impact mechanical and electrical plant performance, and how will humidity impact water safety, security, and availability? So you can start to see these questions being raised. Now, the biggest issue that I have currently is that we're not doing this in a consistent way, because there's no uniform models or scenarios that are used in a consistent and comparable manner. We know that the world is going to change, but we aren't using the right information to inform that analysis and inform design decisions, whether that's a greenfield or a brownfield project. So that's just an example here. And what we are really trying to do ultimately is understand what's our safe operating zone, what's our tolerance levels, and at what point in time in the future will that be triggered, and if it's going to be triggered. Once we understand that, then we can have the interventions. And there's a range of different interventions, but I just wanted to highlight humidity. Obviously, it's a key risk here, but there's other perils. And just that thinking is very, very important to understand why it's important, how might it impact us, but then understanding what your safe operating zone is absolutely critical.
And why do you think it is that people are not responding at the moment or taking that into consideration? Is it a fact of the matter that it's the costs are cheaper, or is it complacency? What kind of has worked in recent decades is continuing to work. And where you do see innovation, are there examples at least of innovation when it comes to building design and cooling systems that have had impact here in the Gulf?
Yeah, I think there is an element of understanding that's a big gap. Look, climate is complex, and so it should be. It's one of the most complex issues that society will ever face. It impacts every part of society, humanity, infrastructure, systems, everything it impacts. And so no wonder it's a complex topic. And within that, there's a whole range of sophistication when it comes to modelling the scenarios and those types of things. I think fundamentally at the core as to why this hasn't been a huge focus in the past is that does the economic system recognise the value of sustainability? The answer is no, because we're a consumption-based society. Our economics is based on consumption. Is that going to be rewired and reframed? More than likely not. So there's a need to value these things in a different way. And so that's one of the reasons why the limited viewpoint on valuing sustainability and designing that in and integrating that into decision making is lacking. But if we, let's use a practical example, because there's a range of different interventions ranging from policy, technology to digital. But if we look at humidity again, if we reframe it, so we understand that humidity is a risk and a threat to us, but let's flip it on the head. So can increasing humidity present opportunities to improve water security and efficiency? That's a question. So from my perspective, if I was asked that, and it's always important where there are risks, there's always opportunities. And that's the other aspect around this we need to think about, and particularly for innovations, we're going to be faced with challenges and we need to flip it on the head. So while humidity is often viewed as a threat, in my perspective, it can provide opportunities in the right context from a security, energy efficiency and manufacturing perspective. So some of the questions you may want to ask from a building design or cooling system perspective is, can we use that atmospheric water for harvesting purposes, potentially for potable water? How can increased humidity improve natural resource production and consumption? Now, that's around the efficiency of plant to capture condensate, for example, from HVAC systems. And do we understand the processes that are required, that require specific humidity levels to operate efficiently? So that's around plant and operational optimization. So some things, yes, will lose out due to humidity, but there's some things that will benefit from it. So once again, it's around reshaping, rethinking our perspective. And when we think about innovation, there's three simple steps. It's how do we design it out or design it in? How do we operate it out or operate it in? And then how do we transfer it out if we can't manage that risk? So that if you think about those three steps, whether it's greenfield or brownfield, and think about the risk and think about the opportunities, you're a long way down the path.
One area, I guess, where a lot of innovation is happening as well is around this food, water, climate nexus that we hear a lot about. It's a particular concern for the Gulf nations, one of the world's driest regions here. Water scarcity, a key issue, but food security as well, because of the over-reliance, if you like, on imports. In some parts, it's 90% nearly of food that's imported. How is that going to impact countries? Are they responding to those challenges and risks, as you say? And what strategies specifically around water scarcity are we seeing here become a priority, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, clearly water is just an absolute, at the forefront of leaders and development. It underpins economic development. Without energy, you have no water. Without water, you have no energy. So they go hand in hand. Now, for the GCC, there's a absolute reliance on seawater desalination, with over 50% of the world's global water being produced from desalinated water. And this technology is often used through reverse osmosis, which is, it's a proven technology, but it does have its drawbacks. And I'm just going to focus on that. So I'm going to focus on this because there's always a trade-off. Now, as an adaptation measure, water desalination is absolutely critical, and it will continue to be a critical mechanism to secure water. But there is an issue, and that issue, I'm going to focus on one specific area, which is the brine discharge. That brine discharge, whilst it's a highly effective mechanism to produce water through reverse osmosis, the byproduct is brine, which is highly concentrated saline effluent, which often has other constituents like antiscalants and chlorine and those types of things, which aren't overly advantageous when discharged back into the sea. So this is creating local salinity issues and other issues around local ecosystems. So when we are thinking around these issues around water scarcity, when we look at them from a very, very individual manner, they're solvable. The technology is typically ready. Commercially, it's dependent on the application and sizing and those types of things. But really the trick is to look at it from a systems perspective, because there's always trade-offs, there's always impacts. And if we're dealing with water scarcity, for example, it needs to be done in a holistic manner that looks at the whole value chain, because the water scarcity issue is going to be a continued issue as economic development continues, energy demand increases, and energy production increases. There's a strong coupling, obviously, with produced water and water demand. It's how we close off the bookends in terms of the issues, particularly around brine discharge, that will help and support us moving forward.
And looking at food security, how does that interact with climate resilience, given the Gulf's over-reliance on imports?
Yeah. I mean, there's probably no better recent examples than in the state of Qatar, through some recent challenges, that the food security issue was highlighted and just the vulnerabilities there. And climate, whilst it's a different trigger, that has the same sort of characteristics in terms of the need to have a diversified supply base, but also have redundancy in that system. I'm going to give you an example, and this example is from a global agricultural provider. And this example here is they have a multitude of different types of assets and facilities and operations globally in North America, Australia, and Europe. Their challenge was around how was climate going to impact them, and is it actually an issue for us as a business? So for their particular type of product that they're producing, when they put a cutting into the ground, from the cutting being planted to market maturity, i.e. by the time it gets under the shelves, is around a 20-year cycle. So what they plant now is incredibly important, and they've got to think about climate, they've got to think about consumer patterns and those types of things. Surprisingly to the board and to the CEO and management, through climate scenario analysis, they were able to determine the resilience of their existing infrastructure and assets, but also consider future investment decisions that would be favourable to the types of crops that they were hunting. And so from that perspective, from a producer's perspective, it absolutely makes sense to consider this and consider climate resilience. Now, from a country like, say, for example, Qatar or Saudi, there is a reliance obviously on imports. But what that means is diversification of suppliers is critical, and understanding the alternatives. There's obviously the option also to build up the critical base of resilience and food security products locally, and that could be done through greenhousing. This region has an abundant mix of natural resources that can be utilised and exploited. It's around understanding what that is and building that out. So there's scope for that to improve. So I'd say climate resilience is critical for food security, but it's not considered at this stage in the GCC.
And let's talk about businesses. A lot of your work, I imagine, involves advising, consulting businesses on how they should be incorporating sustainability into their operations. How are they responding here in the Gulf, particularly when it comes to issues like protecting their supply chains and the ESG considerations, if not pressures, that they feel to act more favorably towards the planet?
Yeah, sure. It's a ranging maturity level, and that's to be expected. And it really depends on the entity's exposures to different stakeholders, policy, regulations, and so forth. But I think the point of distinction for me in this market is that there is policy and mechanisms that are driving performance and requirements for certain sectors. But for me, the point of difference for the GCC is around the connection between sustainability and economic returns on investment. That's a critical thing that the GCC looks at a holistic level, and it's the right thing to do, to be honest, in terms of connecting sustainability to value creation. If there's no connection there, then it's almost impossible to get business and government to make decisions around it. And so that's a key thing for anybody in whatever sector you're operating in, is work through in your own context, because there's no off-the-shelf product or off-the-shelf way to do this until there's a global commodity price for sustainability aspects like carbon and other things. But that's currently not the case. So for us, we need to value sustainability in our own context. And the way you do that is, whether that's an enterprise or whether that's a government, is connecting that back to your primary service, your primary offering, that whether that be, you measure that through revenue, cost or margins, or asset management, whatever it will be, understanding how sustainability, through climate resilience, through natural capital, through circularity, how that impacts enterprise value, similarly how it impacts your shareholders, if you do have shareholders, and then social and stakeholder value. So once you start to build that stack cost and stack effort up, you really get a clear view around where the value levers are. And from that perspective, you're in a really, really good position to understand the interventions and apply economics to them and develop business cases. Now, that's utopia. Are people there yet? No. And where the key concern and key efforts are is, to be honest, a lot of it's in the primary data at this stage. I'd say the GCC as a whole is behind in primary data quality compared to other regions. And that's important because primary data is a fundamental input into any sort of investment decision. If you have poor primary data, then the rest sort of falls over. So that needs to be improved, and there is steps to improve that across most sectors. The only other thing I'll just add to this before I close off on this question is, from the GCC perspective, we're typically not a market maker when it comes to this because we are exporting a lot of products. So we are a taker. And I think that will continue because our off-takers, our customers of our products and services, once they start to demand these types of things, we'll see a market shift, I think, from a GCC perspective. But clearly it's not strong enough yet as a signal to materially change what this region is producing and providing to the global markets.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to watch what happens elsewhere as well, particularly with Europe and the carbon border adjustment mechanism. If there is movement there and that becomes more widespread, it will be interesting to see how Gulf states respond. I just wanted to, something popped into my head, which I wanted to get your thoughts on. The trajectory then with these national plans seems positive. Could the curveball be the development of AI? You're seeing all three major Gulf states, Saudi, UAE, and Qatar, be very active in AI recently. They position themselves as a natural choice for data centers empowering AI's growth. Is that going to set back the climate targets for the region, or do you think it might actually aid them and become an opportunity to move to a greener region?
Yeah, I mean, from my personal perspective, it's, I use AI and a range of traditional AI. We're starting to use agentic AI for specific tasks. Now, from a working perspective, it's absolutely fantastic. Now, I'm going to give you an example of how the benefits will be applied, for example, from a climate perspective. But once again, there's always a trade-off, and the trade-off is obviously energy consumption and those types of things. But we've got the technology to manage that. And yes, the demand is going to be significant demand for these data centers and these other associated types of operations that go hand in hand with AI. But we do have the technology readiness to address that from an energy perspective. Now, I'm just going to give you a positive example around how we view and how we use AI to help solve some of these wicked problems. So currently, a lot of the climate models back solve the most efficient pathway to get to an end state. So that applies different things like policy interventions, technology interventions, learning rates, and those types of things. Now, for business, if we're looking at business specifically, when they get this information, we're presented with a problem to say, this is where we are now, this is where we need to be, this is our current pathway. And what that's creating is a delta between where we need to be versus our pathway or trajectory. A lot of the time, that gap is solved through manual interventions or manual studies, and it's not overly dynamic. Now, we're using, for example, going down the pathway of AI to continuously monitor, scrape technology interventions, looking at the capital costs associated with those that simply a human just couldn't do in the time that's required and to the quality that's required. Just the effort that's needed to monitor this, because it's continuously changing. And so what we're doing is we're using AI to see what's the most effective pathway to close that gap based on a number of conditions. But for example, it could be CCUS. We're training an agentic AI, agentic agent to focus on CCUS, for example, and focusing on technology learning rates specific to an application in industry. You can imagine that now coupled across all different sectors. Suddenly, you've got an incredibly powerful mechanism using AI to solve a challenge that, if an individual business most of the time just doesn't have the capacity to be able to deal with. So I think for me, there's always a trade-off. Once again, the trade-off is natural resource management. I think this region we can deal with that. There's obviously increased capacity that's going to be required. There's going to be cooling that's going to be required. We could potentially submerge these types of data centers in sort of locations. There's different engineering techniques to engineer that risk out. I think it's just more around how do we use this for the benefit, and how do we commoditize this, and how do we make people make better decisions. That's the opportunity and the economic upside for the GCC.
Yeah, and reassuring, I guess, in that sense, then the major energy players in the region are taking such an active role in driving a lot of this forward. Climate resilience, though, ultimately, it's not just about policies or projects. It's about people at the end of the day. They need to change behaviors and be on board as well. Looking at the next generation, how can GCC states ensure that younger people are engaged and communities are engaged in sustainability to ensure long-term impact?
Yeah, it's actually a very timely question. Actually, I was over in the MISC Foundation, which is in Saudi Arabia, and MISC, they had a fantastic initiative a couple of months ago. So this would, at the time of this recording, it would have been in September, November 2025, and they brought together 27 young leaders from different countries around the world. Actually, they represented 27 different countries as well, and their mandate was how do we inject a youth element into policies that have been created from a green and AR transition perspective. And I just thought that was exactly what is needed. And the reason for that is, I always go back to this, even if we stop emitting today, we've locked ourselves in for at least another 20 years of warming before the Earth system stabilizes. So for myself, I'm unfortunately no longer deemed as a younger person. I feel I have the responsibility, along with others who are in that older generation bucket. It's our responsibility. This is a known issue now. We need to have we need to accept that responsibility and treat this as our legacy to leave a positive impact. And as a young person, that should really energize you to step up and have a voice. Once again, even if we stop emitting today, we've locked ourselves in for 20 years of warming before the Earth system starts to stabilize. But we know that's not the case. We're increasing emissions, and we've already triggered a 1.5 degree future. So, I'll state that again. We've triggered a 1.5 degree increase for the first time in 2024, and it looks like for 2025 we'll be doing the same as well. So the pathway, the trajectory is undesirable and not consistent with broader ambitions. So I think for myself, it's around being energized around this. And for the older generation as well, it's responsibility and legacy that we should take on, because this is known. We can't be burying our heads in the sand anymore. This is an absolutely known issue for us.
A final point then, looking ahead, what would a climate resilient GCC look like, do you think, by 2050?
Yeah, from a pure resilience perspective, when I think of resilience, it's around the economies, the people, being able to absorb those shocks, recover, and be able to maintain those essential services and functions as a society. So I'd say that's the base case and absolute minimum. But from my perspective, we need to go way beyond this as a society and as a region. We need to get to predictive, adaptive capacity that will mitigate those damages, any potential damages, but importantly, capitalize on the opportunities that will present themselves as markets transition and as the environment physically changes as well. Now, we know that moving forward, the GCC will continue to produce hydrocarbon products. That's a given for not perpetuity, but nothing's in perpetuity, but for the foreseeable future, hydrocarbons is a core element of the development of GCC countries. So it's around how that hydrocarbon is utilised may change, and also the energy sector will become diversified potentially, and that's different liquid and gaseous fuel provided to markets, as well as a diversified economy. That will create that resilience from a general climate mitigation and adaptation perspective. Now, my closing comment though for this one, when I think about what GCC looks like in 2050, is that 2050 is not that far away now. It's only 25 years, which really for these countries in the GCC specifically, where long-term planning's a key part of any sort of planning activities, this is not far away. And the real test for me is not actually going to be 2050. The real test is going to be how GCC countries will respond between 2050 and 2100. If we look at most of the climatic models, all the funky stuff starts to happen in the 2050s to 2100. Second half of this century. So that's things like net negative kicks into gear for some pathways. That's when we're really starting to see climate hazards intensify. And from a regional perspective, the MENA region is highly exposed to these changes. So for me, I say, which is conceptually challenging as well, because in net zero and those types of claims that are committed to, that is a challenge, and that's by 2050. But that's just the entree. The main course is 2050 to 2100, and there's going to be a huge change from a systems perspective, and a huge change that be required from an economic perspective if we are to meet those challenges.
Yeah, it's a really, really important point as well. I think from the human perspective and social aspect, to see what changes it will bring about if the climate scenarios that are predicted, as you say, in the second half of this century come to fruition. How people move, where they move to, for example, could be an important one to watch. But very, very right, I think, in highlighting that it's got to be front and center of minds when it comes to acting, not just for governments, but businesses and individuals as well. Michael, thank you. Today's conversation, a reminder, I think, that sustainability here in the Gulf isn't just about reducing emissions, but rethinking how we power our economies, design our cities, secure water and food, as you touched upon, and engage communities as well. Big challenges, no doubt about that, but so are the opportunities, as we mentioned, from renewable energy to green finance and youth-led innovation. Michael, thank you for the excellent insights and joining us, and we look forward to the second part of this session as well. And thank you, of course, for listening. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and keep imagining a sustainable tomorrow.